As I discuss in my policy paper, I know a good deal about what it's like to navigate inside of a major US city and a suburban community. I do believe I come to you today with information from a place of good authority as it relates to the subject of urban sprawl and suburban development. What exactly is urban sprawl though? As I discuss it in the paper, I took from a Yale Ledger article where it was described as a form of unplanned urban and suburban development that takes place over a large area and creates a low density environment with a high segregation between residential and commercial areas. I don't entirely agree with that description. I believe that in large part urban sprawl is in fact planned. It's just not organized, and I stress the difference between those two words in this paper. I believe that people in society have in fact chosen sprawl in a way that placed the wagon before the horse, meaning that people moved into suburbia before the infrastructure was there to support that population, and thus they forever pay the price in terms of a never-ending game of catch-up. The main issue here becomes a lack of resources. The population's exit from their respective former cities will cause a lack of tax base and increase the decommercialization and ultimately a reduction in resources for the community that continues to live in that metro area. And as discussed above, the newly created suburban area will also struggle to keep up with demands and thus have a low resource pool. It's ironic, I think it goes without saying that a lot of people specifically choose a suburban lifestyle to move away from the city, thinking that they're going to overcome all of the perceived challenges of the city that they have from their viewpoint. Crime, noise, overpopulation, overcrowding. You could kind of go on, make the argument that I think ironically you move into suburbia and you wind up struggling with a lot of the same issues, except you have half the resource pool. And now, city A over here, the original city that you came from, they're struggling now with half the resource pool too, because half of you have left. And the place that you've now come to that only has half of the previous capacity is going to struggle as well, because you don't have the human capital in really either environment now. And so you don't have that tax base. It's ironic, right? Because I live in a county environment where people pay really high property tax. And the general consensus tends to be that they're like, well, where is it going? Because when you live in a county outside of a city, you typically have less services. So sometimes it's kind of the price you pay to get that space that you desire. But you don't have so many parks, emergency services are not as readily available, there's not going to be sidewalks, there's not going to be bike lanes. Of course, this isn't a one size fits all, but that's oftentimes the experience. I'll just tell you my interesting and possibly unpopular opinion in the words that I used in the paper. Despite the many fantastic best practices listed above, which I'll talk about in a minute, you may notice one key feature, which is that none of these examples are explanations of change-making efforts. Did I suggest that we need to write off suburban development completely? Mostly because it's not feasible and won't happen. However, there are plenty of opportunities we as policymakers and policy changers can capitalize on in order to reduce its negative impacts on society. In short, you can call it pessimistic, but I think that a lot of the damage has been done. We can definitely make steps towards decreasing the possibility that it continues to happen, that you continue to sprawl. I'm a really big advocate for placemaking, community building inside of urban areas and metro spaces, which attracts people to stay there. It gets rid of stereotypes about these places. Tourism get better. It gives a lot of opportunities for those metro spaces, but to kind of abandon these places or jump ship and somehow move back to the metro, and have all these weird abandoned ghost towns, it's not logical, it's not feasible, right? So I tend to focus a little more on how do we create healthier environments that don't have the challenges that I'm going to talk about right now. Are some of the challenges that I discuss in the paper. One, it's increased greenhouse gas emissions, issues of air pollution, high roadway congestion, a severe lack of affordable housing. I also talk about health impacts, just generally speaking, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, more problems that are structural in nature, like increased strain on transportation and infrastructure. And then there's a lot of social problems that are mentioned as well, social segregation and decreased social participation, seeing their neighbors having those community building endeavors. These are essentially the problems that I outline in the paper, more or less, that come from the just severity or the level of urban sprawl that we're experiencing, and then also just the outcome of that, what that actually looks like for the community in which the sprawl occurs in. So in the paper, I talked about a couple best practice communities. In California, they have a law where each community is required to do housing assessment studies and assess the inventory that they have and versus their needs, and they have to account for things like their socioeconomic trends, and make decisions appropriately regarding affordable housing, so you don't wind up with a housing situation that's strictly market driven. I also talk about New Jersey. They are focused on that low to moderate income housing. The county level, they require that communities essentially account for their quote fair share of the need for affordable housing. It's like whatever your little hub is, however your stats are coming out, if you've got 50% of your community who's low to moderate income, and then you have a community next door, 30% of their community is low to moderate income, they make you account for at least your portion of your community who needs that housing product, and you have to work that into your housing doctrine and how you go about developing in your community. Talk a little bit in here about how Austin in Texas, it's not a done deal yet, but that they are working on similar type plans to try to allow for more high density development and address their building criteria, try to allow for some more allotments of row homes, townhomes, and garden homes. I even talk a little bit about my trip to the Netherlands and some things that I was able to take back from them regarding impervious cover, because that tends to be a concern. It was in Austin about, is it environmentally friendly to build with such high density, or is it not? Do you have adverse effects? So I talk about some things I learned in my trip to the Netherlands about how to combat that and to kind of build green ecosystems inside your cityscape, so you're doing no disservice to the environment. And I talk about how easy it was actually for me to bring some of those ideas home with me from the Netherlands. So even in the smallest of communities, you can implement these details that, despite the sprawl that has already taken place, you can make the change and make the difference. Which kind of leads me to the takeaways portion of the paper, where essentially I advocate that you need to focus on transportation. I talk about increasing opportunities for mass transit and active transportation. It cuts down on greenhouse gas emissions, moves people faster. Active transport helps with your health too, of course. I talk about creating public spaces, bridge that gap of having that lack of community, lack of interaction with others because of a suburban lifestyle. It also creates beautiful spaces, increased tax opportunities, build communities. So this talks about create a vibrant and unique community and create affordable housing stock, editing those building development codes that are really restrictive in nature, that don't allow for things like row houses, townhouses, garden homes, smaller lot sizes, upstairs, downstairs, commercial residential development, and the list goes on. Diversifying those things, I believe, beautifies your community, diversifies your human capital, and definitely creates opportunities for affordable housing. To remember three things. One, city planning is not an us versus them mentality. Inclusivity and diversity is, in fact, the goal. Two, we cannot stop suburban development, but we can model it after great cities of the past and present to curb its negative effects. Three, never be afraid to right a wrong. Review your code constantly and seek opportunities for change.